How does that feel around the shoulders?
It's perfect. The lace sits beautifully now.
That no lace-detailed gown could hide. Her steps toward the altar were deliberate, yet her red-rimmed eyes revealed 15 years of a curated, hollowed-out soul, weary from a grief she had been taught to bury under layers of tradition. The heavy iron gates of the courtyard creaked, and a disheveled man huddled against them, his clothes tattered and skin weathered by a life lived far beyond the limits of her high society bubble. The wedding guests looked away with silent disdain, but Olivia found herself frozen, her bridal mask slipping as she watched the intruder's slumped, non-aggressive posture. The man's face was gaunt, his pale, clouded eyes staring into a hollow distance, yet he held a sense of resigned dignity that seemed out of place in his rugged state. Olivia watched him carefully, unaware that this ragged encounter would soon shatter the sterile world she had built to protect herself from the shadow of her lost brother. The man didn't plead for money. Instead, he tilted his head as if listening to a ghost from 20 years ago. As the security team moved to intervene, a sudden jerky motion exposed the man's hand. He didn't reach out to strike, but leaned forward just enough for the morning light to catch a jagged, star-shaped mark carved into his rough skin. The sight held a meaning deeper than words, a secret pact waiting patiently for the courage to reveal a miracle. Confused and repulsed, the guests urged her forward, assuming it was a mere visual blight on the ceremony. But the moment Olivia's fingers brushed the man's calloused hand to comfort him, an uneasy electricity rose, as if fate had reached out from a shallow grave. She looked down at the star-shaped scar, her fingers trembling as she traced the familiar lines she had once shared with him. The realization was simple yet heavy. This was the mark of the Monroe blood, a pact never forgotten despite the years of silence. Her breath caught, but shock deepened because the man before her looked nothing like the vibrant boy who had disappeared. She looked closer into his lined, tired face and froze, discovering a familiar warmth in those blind, clouded eyes that contradicted the gray, unkempt hood. Shock filled her instantly, wondering how a vagrant could possess a mark that had been buried by history and grief for 15 years. Memories of the dark day and the disappearance rushed back, the fear of her own survival pressing heavily against the Monroe dynasty. In that silent moment, as the jeweled tiara felt like a weight of lead, she sensed this was not a trespasser, but the beginning of a truth waiting to unfold, a realization that blood never truly disappears, regardless of the lace and silk used to hide the pain. The morning air inside the Monroe estate was sharp and clinical, a sterile silence that even the frantic rustle of silk could not disturb. Olivia Monroe stood before the floor-to-ceiling gilded mirror, a masterpiece of tradition and expectations. The wedding gown was a marvel of intricate lace detailing, the sleeves hugging her arms like a second skin, yet as the stylist fussed over the train, Olivia felt a familiar, hollowed-out stiffness that no amount of couture could soften. She was the diamond of the season, the centerpiece of a union designed to merge two global financial empires, but as she looked at her reflection, she saw only a porcelain ghost. Every stitch of the refined white gown felt like a brick in a wall she had built to insulate herself from a grief that had never truly quieted. 15 years had passed since the dark day Daniel vanished, leaving a void that her parents had filled with board meetings and social obligations. She had learned to trade her tears for rehearsed grace, mourning not with cries, but with the cold, clinical precision demanded of a Monroe heir. As the head stylist placed the jeweled tiara atop her soft bridal updo, the weight of the diamonds felt like a leaden crown, pinning her to a destiny she had ceased to question. The room smelled of expensive lilies and the suffocating scent of a life held in stasis. Her mother stood in the doorway, her expression one of professional pride rather than maternal warmth, nodding at the mausoleum of lace that Olivia had become. Outside, the world was vibrant, prepared for the wedding of the century. But inside the suite, the air was thick and cloying, reminiscent of the morning mist that had swallowed her brother's laughter so long ago. Olivia moved toward the window, her thin veil flowing behind her like a shroud. Below, the manicured lawn was a sea of formal attire and public scrutiny. She watched the security detail flanking the iron gates, their movements as deliberate and cold as the spreadsheets her groom used to measure their future. She was a bird in a gilded cage, about to be moved to a larger, more expensive sanctuary. Her heart thundered against her ribs, not with the flutter of a nervous bride, but with the frantic rhythmic drumming of someone waiting for a silence that even money could not buy. She took a final jagged breath, adjusted the lace at her wrists, and prepared to step out into the light, unaware that the sterile world she had built was minutes away from shattering. The heavy iron gates of the cathedral courtyard, cold and unyielding, stood as the final barrier between Olivia's curated past and her scripted future. As the bridal procession began its slow, rhythmic march, the air was pressurized with the expectant hum of the elite and the sharp, clinical click of cameras. Olivia moved with a hollowed-out grace, her gaze fixed forward, until the lead security guard's hand moved instinctively toward his belt, snapping the sterile perfection of the moment. A figure had emerged from the periphery, a staggering, heavy-hearted discordance in a sea of silk and mourning suits. The intruder was a man forged in the dirt of the earth, his frayed garment riddled with holes, his posture hunched not in aggression, but in a raw, primal plea. To the wedding planners and the groom's family, he was a filthy visual blight to be neutralized before he could mar the century's grandest transaction. "Stay back. This is private property," a guard barked, his voice slicing through the scent of lilies. The guests exchanged looks of thinly veiled disgust, waiting for the vagrant to be ushered back into the shadows where he belonged. But Olivia found herself rooted to the stone path, her professional mask slipping as she watched the man collapse onto his knees. The wind tugged at her thin veil, but her focus was locked on the stranger's trembling hands. As the guards reached to haul him away, the man made a sudden jerky motion, thrusting his palm upward in a gesture of desperate negotiation. In that fragile silence, the morning light caught the back of his hand, and Olivia's blood turned to ice. Standing out sharply against his rough, weathered skin was a jagged star-shaped mark. It was a scar she hadn't seen in 15 years, yet she knew every line of its geometry. It was the revelatory spark that reached out from the grave of her childhood. Memories of the dark day rushed back, the smell of river silt and the sound of a boy's laughter before the silence took him. The security guards tightened their grip, but Olivia let out a strangled, breathless cry that silenced the cathedral bells. Her hand, gloved in delicate lace, reached out toward the grime-stained skin of the beggar. She wasn't looking at a trespasser anymore. She was looking at a miracle carved in flesh, a secret pact that had survived the dark water. Ignoring the frantic whispers of her mother and the cold stare of her groom, Olivia knelt in the dirt, her expensive gown blooming like a dying lily around her, as she realized the shadow at the gate was the brother she had buried in her heart a lifetime ago. The scent of the cathedral lilies dissolved, replaced instantly by the sharp metallic tang of river silt and the sweet aroma of wild summer grass. In the theater of Olivia's memory, the world was no longer clinical or gray. It was a vibrant, chaotic green. She was 10 years old again, crouching in the secret hollow of the weeping willow with Daniel, their breathing synchronized in the heat of a July afternoon. Between them lay a jagged piece of flint, its edge catching the dappled sunlight. They had called it the Pact of the Star. With the solemnity of ancient kings, Daniel had taken the stone first, etching a rough, five-pointed star into the back of his hand. He hadn't flinched, his blue eyes bright with a fierce, protective loyalty. "As long as we have the star, Olivia," he had whispered, his voice steady despite the small bead of blood, "we can never be truly lost. It's a compass. It always points home." She had followed suit, the sting of the flint a small price for the ironclad certainty that they were a world unto themselves, a duo that no Monroe decree or boarding school distance could ever break. But the vibrance of that memory was a cruel prelude to the dark day that followed. The sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, the air thick and cloying with an approaching storm. They were in the back of the vintage sedan, laughing about a stolen jar of jam, while the rain began to lash against the glass like 1,000 frantic fingers. Then came the screech, a sound that had never quite left the architecture of Olivia's nightmares. It was the sound of metal groaning against metal, the world turning upside down in a violent, dizzying blur of shattered glass and spinning upholstery. Olivia remembered the icy bite of the ravine water as it surged into the cabin, a suffocating weight that tasted of oil and ancient mud. She remembered Daniel's hand slipping from hers, his fingers brushing against the star-shaped mark on her own skin one last time before the current took him. She had screamed into the abyss, her voice swallowed by the roar of the river, watching as the dark water claimed the only person who truly knew her soul. For 15 years, she had lived in the silence that followed that crash, a silence she had mistaken for peace. Now, kneeling in the dirt of the cathedral, the sting of that old scar seemed to throb in rhythm with the man's heartbeat, proving that while the river had taken the boy, the star had finally guided the man home. The heavy, clinical silence of the cathedral courtyard shattered as the groom Julian stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching rhythmically on the gravel with a sound like bone breaking. He reached down, his fingers manicured and cold, gripping Olivia's arm with a firm, cautionary pressure that demanded she return to the script. "Olivia, enough of this performance," he hissed, his voice a low, buzzing drone of social embarrassment. "Security will handle this vagrant. Think of the guests. Think of the merger." Behind him, Olivia's mother stood like a monument of ivory and ice, her jaw set in a line of cold impatience, her eyes darting to the clicking cameras of the press with thinly veiled disgust. Olivia didn't pull away. She rose with a violent, jagged energy that tore the lace of her sleeve from Julian's grasp. She turned on them, her red-rimmed eyes burning with a soul-deep fire that made the billionaire's professional armor crack. "A performance?" she rasped, her voice a fractured, breathless cry that echoed against the stone walls. "You call my brother a performance?" She stepped back toward the huddled man, her hand shielding him as if he were the last flame in a winter storm. "Look at him," she commanded, her voice rising to a primal scream that silenced the murmuring elite. "Don't look at the rags or the dirt. Look at his eyes." Julian and her mother froze, pinned by the tractor beam of Olivia's desperation. For the first time, they were forced to see past the visual discordance of the beggar to the man beneath the hood. The stranger tilted his head back, and as the morning sun struck his pale, clouded eyes, the hollow, distant stare held a terrifyingly calm certainty. In that pressurized silence, the milky cataracts seemed to reflect a history they had spent 15 years trying to bury. "He is a Monroe," Olivia declared, her fingers trembling as she pointed to the star-shaped scar that pulsed with a life of its own against the man's weathered skin. Her mother's professional mask finally slipped, revealing a flicker of raw, primal fear, while Julian looked at the man with the clinical disdain of a man whose life was measured in square footage and profit margins. They saw a liability, a delusional hoax that threatened their sterile transaction, but Olivia saw a miracle made of dust and blood. She stood between the altar and the gate, her jeweled tiara discarded in the gravel, choosing the broken past over the perfect future they had sold her. The world of logic screamed for her to let go, but her heart, long dormant and encased in ice, had finally felt the heat of a truth that even money could not buy. The stranger's lips parted, and the sound that emerged was a hollow, fractured rasp, as if his vocal cords were as rusted as the iron gates that had nearly kept him out. He spoke of the dark water first, not as a memory, but as a living, suffocating weight that had never truly left his lungs. He described the sensation of the world turning upside down, the cold bite of the river, and the way the moon had looked through the surface of the water, a distorted, shimmering coin he couldn't reach. Olivia listened paralyzed as he detailed the exact, jagged sequence of the impact, the smell of the upholstery and the sound of the metal groaning, details that had been locked in police files and Olivia's own nightmares for 15 years. The man told of a savior who was also a captor, a reclusive laborer terrified of the authorities, who had pulled him from the silt and the reeds miles downstream. This man, burdened by a broken mind, had seen not a socialite's heir, but a shattered boy with no name. Daniel explained that the head injury had wiped his world into a white, featureless void, and the infection from the river silt had slowly stolen his sight, leaving him in a permanent twilight. For years he had lived in a shack in the deep woods, his identity replaced by the survival instincts of a ghost. The laborer had never reported finding him, fearing he would be accused of kidnapping, keeping Daniel as a silent companion to his own isolation. "I lost the light," Daniel whispered, his clouded eyes filling with a sudden glassy moisture. "But I never lost the sound." He explained how the fog in his mind had only recently begun to thin, sparked by the echo of a voice on a passing radio that sounded like the lullabies they had shared. He spoke of how he had spent months wandering toward the city, guided by the pull of a sister he could no longer see but could always hear in the architecture of his mind. He told Olivia that he hadn't come for the Monroe fortune. He had come because the compass on his hand had finally pointed home. Every word felt like a stitch being ripped from Olivia's heart, a 15-year-old wound reopening to reveal that the boy hadn't died in the dark water. He had simply been waiting in the silence for his sister to hear him. The cathedral bells began to toll, a heavy rhythmic demand for order that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the courtyard. Inside the sanctuary, the priest stood framed by the golden glow of the altar, his shadow stretching toward the gates like a silent command to proceed. From the pews, a low buzzing drone of unrest rose from the guests, the architects of Olivia's sterile world, who viewed this delay not as a miracle, but as a scandalous breach of protocol. "Olivia, the ceremony must continue," her mother urged, her voice a sharp, clinical blade that cut through the morning air. "Think of your name. Think of the legacy you are about to throw away for a phantom." Julian stepped closer, his hand reaching for Olivia's with the cold, calculated intent of a man closing a final transaction. "He is a stranger in rags, Olivia. A fabrication of your own grief," he hissed, his eyes reflecting the high society armor he expected her to wear. The priest appeared at the threshold, his presence a moral weight meant to anchor her back to the script of the wedding of the century. "The eyes of the world are upon you, daughter," he intoned, his voice echoing the suffocating tradition that had held her in stasis for 15 years. Olivia looked from the altar of gold and lies to the man kneeling in the dirt. She saw the way Daniel flinched at the harshness of the voices, his clouded eyes searching for the one sound that had guided him home. In that pressurized moment, the mausoleum of lace she wore felt like a physical cage, its intricate detailing a mesh of expensive sterile insulation. She realized that if she stepped toward the altar, she would be burying Daniel for a second time, choosing a hollow crown over the blood that beat in her own veins. With a sudden jerky motion that made the crowd gasp, Olivia reached for the jeweled tiara. She didn't adjust it, she tore it from her hair, the diamonds clattering against the gravel like discarded glass. She turned her back on the priest, the groom, and the global financial empire waiting inside the cathedral. "The wedding is over," she declared, her voice no longer a rehearsed grace but a primal cry of loyalty. She knelt back in the dirt, her expensive gown blooming like a dying lily as she took Daniel's hand, finally choosing the broken truth over the perfect lie. The transition was not a graceful exit, but a violent shedding of a skin that had never truly fit. As Olivia led Daniel away from the iron gates, the gasps of the elite followed them like the hiss of a retreating tide, but she did not look back at the altar she had desecrated with her honesty. Her mother's voice, sharp and clinical, called out her name, not as a daughter but as a failing asset, yet the sound was drowned out by the rhythmic thrum of Olivia's heart, finally beating for someone other than the Monroe dynasty. Inside the shadowed interior of the waiting limousine, the air was pressurized with the weight of her choice. Olivia reached for the back of her gown, her fingers fumbling with the intricate lace that had felt like a mesh of expensive insulation. With a jagged pull, she loosened the bodice, the silk falling away in a heap of ruined finery on the floor of the car. She reached for her ears, tearing away the diamond drops that had been meant to signify a union of empires, tossing them onto the velvet seat like discarded glass. The thin veil, once a flowing shroud of tradition, was stripped away and left behind in the dust of the cathedral courtyard. She turned to Daniel, who sat in the dim light, his tattered hooded garment a jarring discordance against the leather interior. He flinched as the engine roared to life, his clouded eyes searching the dark. "Olivia," he whispered, his voice still a fractured rasp. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she took his weathered hand, pressing the star-shaped scar on her own palm against his. The contact was an electric current of recognition, a silent pact renewed in the wreckage of her social standing. As the city blurred past the tinted windows, Olivia felt the mausoleum of glass she had lived in for 15 years finally shatter. She was no longer the diamond of the season or a bird in a gilded cage. She was a woman in a simple slip, covered by a discarded coat, sitting beside a ghost who had returned to life. The jewels were gone, the silk was stripped, and the Monroe name was likely a stain in the morning papers. But as she watched the light play across Daniel's tired face, she realized she had finally traded her crown for her soul. The journey was no longer toward a curated future, but into the raw, unpolished truth of a brother found in the silence. The clinical warmth of the Monroe estate was gone, replaced by a silence that felt jagged and predatory. Within hours of the wedding that never was, the machinery of the Monroe dynasty had turned against Olivia with a cold corporate vengeance. She sat in the dim light of a small rented apartment, a stark discordance to the marble hall she had inhabited only yesterday, watching the flickering screen of her phone. The notifications arrived like a barrage of stones. Her credit cards declined, her access to the family trust severed, and her name dragged through the digital mud of high society tabloids. To her mother and the abandoned groom, she was no longer a daughter or a bride. She was a liability that had been aggressively liquidated. The social fallout was a physical weight, a mausoleum of glass shattering in the public eye. Julian's lawyers had already moved with clinical precision to freeze the joint accounts intended for their union, leaving Olivia with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small savings she had kept hidden for years. The diamond of the season had been discarded, yet as she looked across the small room at Daniel, Olivia felt a strange, terrifying lightness. Daniel sat on the edge of a worn sofa, his clouded eyes tracking the sound of her breathing. He was a man who had survived 15 years in the white void of amnesia and the dark water of the ravine, and his presence was a living reminder of what truly mattered. "You shouldn't have done it, Olivia," he whispered, his voice a fractured rasp of guilt. "The Empire. You gave it all away for a ghost." Olivia walked over and knelt beside him, her fingers tracing the star-shaped scar on his hand, the only currency that still held value in her world. "I didn't give it away, Daniel," she said, her voice steady and fiercely loyal. "I traded a prison for a brother." The price of her loyalty was the loss of her sterile insulation, her mansions and her status, but she had gained a miracle made of blood and memory. She spent the evening calculating their meager resources, not with the cold spreadsheets of a billionaire, but with the desperate protective energy of a survivor. Every door that slammed shut in her face only solidified her devotion. She realized that the Monroe name was a shackle she had finally broken, and while the world outside saw a fallen socialite, Olivia saw a woman who was finally home. The sterile, clinical white of the hospital corridor was a far cry from the gilded halls of Monroe Manor, yet for Olivia, it felt like the first place she had ever truly belonged. A year had passed since the day she knelt in the cathedral dust, trading a dynastic crown for the tattered sleeve of a ghost. The mausoleum of glass she once inhabited had been dismantled, replaced by the rhythmic, grounded reality of Daniel's recovery. Every dollar she had clawed back from her frozen life had been funneled into this moment, the hope that the dark water had not stolen her brother's sight forever. The surgeon moved with a deliberate, quiet grace as he began to unwind the bandages from Daniel's face. The air in the room was pressurized, thick with the scent of antiseptic and a decade and a half of held breath. Olivia stood at the bedside, her hand, no longer gloved in expensive lace, gripping Daniel's with a fierce, protective energy. The star-shaped scars on their hands pressed against one another, a secret compass finally finding its true north. As the last layer of gauze fell away, Daniel didn't move. His clouded eyes flickered, the milky cataracts having been replaced by a startling, clear blue that mirrored Olivia's own. The silence of the room was heavy, a physical weight that seemed to vibrate as his pupils struggled to anchor themselves in the light. Then a small jagged breath escaped his lips. "Olivia," he whispered, his voice no longer a fractured rasp, but a sound gaining strength. His gaze shifted, slowly finding her face, tracing the lines of a sister, he had only known as a voice in the architecture of his mind. I can see the star. He wasn't looking at the scar on her hand, but at the light in her eyes. Tears, not of shock or anguish, but of a soul finally finding the shore, streamed down Olivia's cheeks. In that moment, she realized the miracle wasn't just in Daniel's restored vision. It was in her own. By stripping away the silk, the diamonds, and the sterile expectations of the Monroe name, she had cleared the fog from her own life. She had saved him from the shadows, but in doing so, she had rescued the girl who had been drowning in the silence of that ravine for 15 years. The wedding of the century was a distant, discarded memory, a tombstone she had finally walked past. As Daniel reached up to touch her cheek, Olivia realized that the pact of the star was complete. They were no longer lost, and for the first time in 2 decades, the morning mist didn't feel like a shroud. It felt like the beginning of a truth that even money could not buy. She was a Monroe, she was a sister, and she was finally, undeniably home.